views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Tonight it's the debate for the Democratic primary in the 86th State Assembly District, the district that includes the Bronx neighborhoods of University Heights, Fordham, Mount Hope, Burnside, and West Tremont. The incumbent is Assemblyman Victor Pichardo, who was first elected to this seat in a special election in November 2013. The challenger is Hector Ramirez, who has run for this seat unsuccessfully 3 times. Tonight's debate is co-sponsored by the League of Women's Voters, a nonpartisan political organization that advocates for informed and active participation in government and works to increase understanding of major public policy issues. We are thrilled to have them on board. The primary election is Tuesday, September 13th, and all eligible voters, of course, are encouraged to vote. Unfortunately, while both candidates were invited to be with us tonight, only one, the incumbent, Mr. Pichardo, accepted our invitation. So unfortunately, Mr. Ramirez will not be here tonight. As a side note, he also chose to not appear in a debate for this seat 2 previous times. By our long-standing policy, as a result, Mr. Pichardo will be interviewed alone on the program. We certainly regret Mr. Ramirez's absence. Nonetheless, good evening, Assemblyman. Nice to have you with us.
Good evening, Gary. Always a pleasure to be with you today.
So the last time you ran against Mr. Ramirez, or he ran against
me,
you,
yes.
I guess would be appropriate.
Sure.
Even though he had been arrested on massive voter fraud charges, you narrowly won by just 11 votes. For somebody who had been an incumbent then and is an incumbent now.
Sure.
It cannot make you feel very comfortable that just 11 votes, even in that circumstance, could have changed that election and maybe even this election. Will it be different this time?
I believe so. I believe the work that not only that I've done as a member of the State Assembly by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, passing paid family leave, putting $20 million towards My Brother's Keeper, and the work that my staff and we have done in helping keep people in their homes and stop tenant harassment through landlords, I think that we're going to win by a much larger margin. But let me just address this really quickly. You mentioned earlier that Mr. Ramirez has not shown up through the last 3 times that he's been invited to debate.
This is the third.
This is the 3rd time. Every time I've been invited, I've shown up. Mr. Ramirez, time and time again, calls himself the candidate of the people, but yet doesn't show his face to the people. I think not only is it sort of the lack of respect that he has for the voters, not only through the massive voter fraud that him and his I guess his brain trust committed, but the fact that he doesn't show his face to defend himself and defend his policies and actually have a platform that helps the neighbors and the folks that I represent in the West Bronx is absolutely disrespectful.
That may be true. I will allow you to say it. He's not here to defend himself, and certainly
Sure.
I'm not going to defend anybody who's not here.
Sure.
That's the beauty of having the seat that could have been available. But again, the election was pretty close.
Sure, of course.
Despite all of that, is that a concern? I mean, why would it have been so close if what you allege is true?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of issues in the politics on the ground. We ran a very clean, stuck to the ideas of the campaign and the platforms that I decided to run on and represent. And to be honest, I believe that Mr. Ramirez engaged not only just not talking to voters and engaging them in that way, but circumventing their ability to voice their votes. And I know that everybody has their day in court, but having a voter fraud indictment that is worth 242 counts speaks for themselves. The election should have gone a different way. Then we could have been talking about another federally indicted individual who did the perp walk before he actually got elected into office, which means that my constituents would have unfortunately not had a seat at the table when we're negotiating a budget in Albany or talking about such important issues like minimum wage or other things that we've been able to accomplish in the last year in Albany.
I want to get into the whole notion of voter disenfranchisement. You've addressed it somewhat in saying that we might have had somebody who, yet again in this seat, Nelson Castro, of course, had been in this seat, and now, you know, we don't even have to get into what that was all about. But in a district of 125,000 residents, I went and did some research on it, 55,000 are of voting age. In the last election, there were all of 3,700 votes in the primary. That is not impressive, regardless of who they voted for, from simply the perspective of participatory democracy. This would suggest that people are disengaged, or maybe they're not interested in participating in the democratic process. What's your vision of the electorate, of the district, that would make this so? Well,
we need to first focus on a lot of quality of life issues that encompass and deal with the issues of my district. The fact of the matter is that the average median income salary in my district is roughly about $20,000 for a family of 4. You can barely pay the rent, put food on the table, and take care and have a decent life. So people tend to be more focused on just surviving and not participating, unfortunately. And what I've really struggled to do and make sure that I've done in my office is engage people where they are. I've really focused on helping form tenants associations around my district, not only for them to encourage civic participation and community participation so that they know what their rights are as tenants, but also just to give them that better sense of community, because once people have that ingrained in their mind, then they want to see something better for themselves. They want to see something better for their communities. And that will translate to more voter participation, more people at community boards, more people at precinct council meetings, wherever they might be, either in the West Bronx or anywhere in the Bronx. And we need to continue that work. And I know that I've focused on that, and I will continue to focus that after this primary when we win, and then we move on into January 2017.
If you summarize many of the problems that would be evident in that district, whether it be healthcare, education, affordable housing, deteriorated housing, I mean, we can go on and on, poverty maybe a large one. It all comes down to standard of living. You have made it clear to me previously that one of your objectives is to raise the standard of living for people in the district. How do you do that, especially when historically it's been this way for a long time?
Sure. Well, I believe in the idea that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So what I've endeavored to do, and one of the things that I've focused on, is to make sure that people actually not only have a livable wage. So let's say if a family, if 2 parents are working both minimum wage jobs, now they'll be able to have an income of at least roughly about $55,000 to $60,000 a year. That will be able to cover the cost of living, be able to cover a lot of the things that they need to pay for. And that increases quality of life because people will be able to afford things. Secondly, also, besides civic participation, we just need to get folks just more involved in understanding what their rights are as tenants, what resources are out there for them. Because sometimes people feel disconnected, which means that they don't see the need to actually engage and connect with government in any way, shape, or form. So we need to change that. And I really have endeavored to do that. And it's a difficult job, but I'm dedicated to doing that. And I know that every single step that we take will maybe bring 1 or 2 voters along, and then we'll have a cascade, hopefully in the near future.
Among the issues with the living wage, the debate went long and hard, more so in the Senate than it did in the Assembly, were that if income goes up for low-income residents, especially in public housing, their rents will go up. And so many people said, well, you're going to get the $15 an hour, but it's going to end up being a wash. The second part of it is, you know, $15 an hour may be better than 12 or even less. There's no question about it. But that's still not enough to really change somebody's standard in a very dramatic way. I always wondered if it would have been possible or would be possible in the future to connect that kind of wage to an educational requirement or something else that would improve future standard of living. So let's do the both ends. One is whether it's a wash in public housing, and then number 2, could it be connected to really empower people to do better?
I think in terms of being a wash for public housing, I don't necessarily agree with that. That's the reason why we're trying to phase this in. We were trying to accelerate it a little faster, but we're phasing this in. We're working with our partners in the city of New York, if they live in public housing, not to necessarily throw people out because they're making a little bit more money, because I was talking to my colleague, Assemblymember Hevesy from Long Island, who's the chair of the Social Services Committee in the Assembly. And what doesn't really make sense is that we penalize people who are trying to get out of poverty in that sense. So, in order for you to qualify for public assistance, you can't own a car for more than $2,000, right? So how exactly are you going to get to work if you have to drive somewhere? Or like, let's say, for example, if a mother divorces a husband and has kids and wins settlement and gets a house, but she doesn't have employment, the state puts a lien on the property in order for that person to get public assistance. So we continue to keep penalizing people for being poor. That's unfortunate. And I know that the conversations that we've already had in the Assembly, we're moving in that direction to make it easier for people to get out of poverty. And that includes that conversation of not only raising the wage, but also working with our partners in the city and the state to make sure that we don't penalize people for being poor. I think that's the wrong approach to do it. And then the second part, I think that's actually a pretty interesting idea.
Well, you make sure that it was noted that Gary presented it during a discussion on BronxTalk.
But I really do believe that, raising the minimum wage is an important step in the right direction. But what we really need to focus on is making it easier for folks to get an education, get their degrees, they have higher paying jobs, so that they, and the state benefits from that. They pay higher taxes, there's more money going to the state, which means can pay for more programs and services. So we have to attack this from a lot of different angles. And I know the minimum wage is one crucial step, but we need to do more in terms of funding education and programs of that nature.
During the month of September, at some point, the city's DCP is going to be released the scoping document for the Jerome Avenue neighborhood study. What do you expect it to show? What do you hope to see? Do you have any inkling of what it'll be, or what are your expectations at this point? And then we can break some of that down.
Sure. Well, first of all, my conversations with the city and my colleagues, I know that Councilmember Vanessa Gibson has really been spearheading the conversations and talks with the city. Is what I really don't want this to happen is that this becomes another Willits Point, which is sort of a boondoggle. We lose jobs, and then at the end of the day, who really benefits? I'm hoping for the best for the scoping document, but to be honest, I really don't want to sort of inject my own theses and theories into it until I see it. I'm more of a tactile kind of guy. But ultimately what I want this is that if it's going to benefit anybody, it has to benefit the residents that have already been there, and that, that folks actually have the opportunity, if it's going to be affordable housing, that folks actually who live in the neighborhood can actually be the first ones in the till, so to speak, so they can have access to these things and not create some sort of new redevelopment zone in the Bronx where we need people to have access to these resources, but then yet they're sort of last in line and they've been sort of suffering and toughing it out.
Can this be done, the kind of sweeping urban renewal plan, for want of a better term, can this be done without displacing somebody, whether it be businesses? I mean, certainly there are all those auto body shops. Some are well-to-do, some are not as well-to-do. And then certainly in the surrounding areas around Jerome Avenue, a lot of concern that residents would be in jeopardy as well.
Well, I mean, the reality is that there will be some pain, but what government should really focus on, both on the city and the state level, is that we need to mitigate that pain as much as possible. I know that I've been in conversations with the auto workers and with the community-based organizations around tenant protections like CASA and those folks. And again, we need to make sure that we create the maximum amount of affordable housing, that it benefits the maximum amount of individuals in the district, but also that it doesn't go to the point where we have to basically rob Peter to pay Paul. We don't want it to get there. And what we want to do in terms of the auto body shops is that we have to create a plan, and the city has to come forward with this as well, that these jobs aren't lost to these residents, because sometimes they're the only breadwinner in the household. So the net effect might be that we're sending more people into shelter and not being able to sustain themselves and sustain their families, and we might be worse off, and we don't want to get to that point.
Let's talk about ethics. It's obviously an ongoing hot topic in Albany. There was concern that the legislature fell well short of dealing with it last year, not addressing the LLC loophole for one. What about this idea that would eliminate outside income for legislators, like what was passed in the city council? Is that an answer? Would you support that?
Well, for me, the only way I earn my living and my income and how I take care of my family is my job as a legislator. So it wouldn't affect me personally or directly. I really believe anything that we can do to make sure that we focus whoever's in office in their job as a legislator, and it's not like a gig or a hobby, I think it's a step in the right direction. But at the same time, you know, there are individuals who represent districts who the housing costs are just astronomically insane. And they have to make a living. They have to be able to take care of themselves, take care of their families. So I don't begrudge them for negotiating something where they're able to earn a living. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm very happy with what I'm making, and the conversations need to be had, but it has to be done in a fair way where we take into consideration not the member that represents somewhere in upstate New York where the cost of living is lower, and some another member who lives in the Upper West Side that they wouldn't be able to afford to do their job and pay their rent or their mortgage or whatever on the salary that they make as legislators.
What do you think, just to go back to housing for a second, what do you think of the mayor's idea to build private facilities, potentially housing or other things, on a land that's allegedly being unused in public housing complexes?
You know, I've gone back and forth with Chairwoman Alatoye on this, and I've had my concerns, and I've expressed this to her directly as well as to the mayor. I think that there's always a sort of the law of unintended consequences, right? So if we start building in NYCHA developments and we start developing private housing or luxury housing in these developments, I mean, the laws of commerce will take hold and take effect. There'll be new resources, yes. There'll be new facilities, yes, but sometimes the folks who live in public housing wouldn't have necessarily access to said resources. So they'll sort of be kind of isolated in sort of another weird economic way. And I understand that there is a need to build affordable housing. I don't necessarily agree with this tact and approach, but if the city is bent on doing this, they need to understand that if they do this, that it has to be done in a way where it's the least pain as possible for the folks. And if it's to help pay for repairs, I think really, and I've said this publicly, I think the state has failed public housing in the city of New York. And I will continue to fight to make sure that the state pays its fair share on public housing dollars in our budgets, to make sure that the folks that I represent in public housing actually get the resources that they deserve.
Let's talk about another vexing issue,
Sure.
if you will. Many years ago, before you were in office, I did a story when BronxNet television had a news show. This predates News 12, if you could imagine that.
Wow.
And it was about a needle exchange program, which was being literally run on a street corner that happens to be in your district. They don't run it out of there anymore. So what I want to do is bring it up to date. It seems that an epidemic that we had thought was long past has returned.
Sure.
And I'm referring directly to the re-emergence of heroin use. It's been reported, we actually covered it on our program, it's been reported in the Norwood News and elsewhere, that the reasons for this, among the reasons, is the increasing cost of pain-killing medication.
Sure.
And so heroin becomes incredibly an available and cheaper substitute.
Sure.
And let's add in that the youth use of synthetic marijuana and K2 is also reaching alarming levels. How do we take a look at this and address this? Are we going back to a time where we, go back to Rockefeller drug laws, or what do we do to address this really difficult and very unfortunate problem?
Sure, let's rewind the clock back to the mid-'80s, early '90s. I was born in '84. But I remember when
I was not asking for your age, even indirectly.
So I remember I was maybe 5 or 6 years old walking down University Avenue or walking Aqueduct Path, where we would see crack pipes everywhere, right? We don't want to come back to that. But at the same time, the government reacted in a way that was detrimental to an entire generation of particularly young men of color. So any sort of possession of any kind of controlled substance could land you, a prison sentence that was 25 to life. And what that did, it was almost like a brain drain out of this community. And when folks came back, they didn't have anything else to do or any place to go or get a job. So that type of reaction was absolutely unnecessary. It was very heavy-handed, and it didn't deal with the problem as it was supposed to. Hopefully, we don't get back to those times. I know that there is always a resurgence of these type of events every couple decades or so, and I know that we put in a lot of money in the state budget to combat and give more services to folks who are experiencing or using or being drug dependent and have this disease. I know that I mentioned earlier, we put $20 million towards My Brother's Keeper, which is the first initiative that, there was an initiative that President Obama launched here in the Bronx, and that it helps particularly young men of color find a better way. So if they get into the gang life or anything like that, we try to pull them out and help them get an education or some sort of technical training so that they're able to take care of their families and better themselves and better their community. I think more of those programs are necessary versus, you get caught with an ounce of K2 or something like that and basically just throw you in jail and just throw away the key, because that didn't work back then, and I can guarantee you right now it will absolutely not work this time around.
Let's talk about that idea of social services.
Sure.
In many communities, and in fact 2 different neighborhoods in the Bronx will be getting YMCAs.
Sure.
The Highbridge Life Center closed, leaving many residents without vital support. Now, if I did my geography correct, there's a Mount Hope Community Center. They have a community center. New Settlement certainly has
Yes,
wonderful
they do.
facilities
Oh, yeah,
and
they
a
do.
wonderful
Sure.
center. Evaluate the
Boys and Girls Club on University Avenue.
Okay. Can anything be put into place? Is your sense that there really is a hole in these kinds of social services as a result of the Highbridge Life Center, or do you believe a lot of that has been absorbed and you're kind of doing okay?
I think it's probably more of a combination of both. I think the more of these services and organizations, the better. And really, the state really has to do a better job of funding these programs. I genuinely believe in the idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You give a young man or a young woman something better to do with their time and their lives, and they will stay out of that. They won't necessarily have to be dependent on these type of substances or any type of negative behavior. And the thing is, at the end of the day, you incarcerating somebody for drugs or anything like that, it costs the state millions and millions of dollars over the course of their prison sentence. So if we instead take that money and reinvest it into the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA, or create some other or help another community-based organization expand their footprint, I think it just makes fiscal sense, first and foremost, but also makes sense to the community, because the community really needs more of the resources, and the more the merrier, to be honest, Gary.
This dialogue, I've had this dialogue since the beginning of this program 21 years ago,
Sure.
but who's counting? And many of your colleagues, certainly the Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Hastie, would be a champion of this. I've talked with him on camera and off camera about
Sure,
these
sure,
things. He's happy about the new YMCA that's coming in.
It's in his district, right?
It's going to be in his actual assembly district. Nice. How do we get, or how do you get, really, people on the other side of the aisle, and it's really in the Senate, and in general, people to understand that this is an answer? I've heard this from many of your colleagues. It was said on the debate that we did the other night,
Sure.
that, gee whiz, if we could reinvest what we spend in criminal justice and put that into community services, we would make a better arrangement. How do we get that dialogue to happen?
Sure. Well, I had the opportunity to host 2 of my colleagues from upstate, Assemblymember Palmisano and Assemblymember Steck, Dan Steck, to come to my district and do a quick tour.
Sorry for not knowing. Democrats, Republicans?
They're both Republicans.
Both Republicans. From upstate?
From upstate New York. I believe Mr. Steck represents the, I want to say not the Finger Lakes, the Lake George area.
Okay.
And Mr. Palmisano represents the Watkins Glen area, I believe. So, a couple of the members here from the Bronx, led by Chairman Crespo and Assemblymember Moya, we sort of do this exchanges. So we visit their districts, they come down to ours.
That sounds very healthy, frankly.
It really does. And, they came down and they were very open. So they came and visited a couple of buildings. They toured a couple of buildings where the landlords didn't provide the services that my constituents deserved. So when they see me jumping on the floor screaming about tenants' rights, they have a better picture. And when we talk about services and stuff like that, they actually understand and see tangibly what's happening here in the West Bronx and in my district. And I think that was very valuable, and I'm actually looking forward to visiting one of their districts in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, because I think when we can disagree, but you don't necessarily have to be disagreeable. And if you show people that the money and the circumstances that are happening in somebody's district, let's say on the issue of criminal justice reform or bringing more resources to a district, I think it's very helpful.
Sounds like a good way to maybe get people from the other side of the aisle to see your point of view. On a similar note, you've been outspoken about gun violence,
yes,
and yet New York has some of the toughest gun laws in the nation. What reform is attainable in the next session? I mean, is this what we got? Is there more we can do in the state of New York, or is it really going to have to be on a national scale in order to really correct the pipeline that we're getting of illegal guns, et cetera?
Sure. Well, unlike some presidential candidates who advocate for building a wall to solve all problems, we unfortunately in the state of New York, we can't do that, and we wouldn't do that, to say the least. We need to work with our partners across the aisle as well as across the country and in the federal level to make gun laws sensible. What sense does it make if a young man is able to get access to a firearm that was legally purchased in the state of Kentucky and make its way up to the Bronx and be used in a crime? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't infringe on people's Second Amendment rights to bear arms. What my concern is that if you want to bear arms, you need to be responsible with
Well,
the
that of
firearms.
course would suggest a national look because,
Yes.
I mean, you can make all the laws you want in the state of New York, but if they're buying it in Kentucky and it's a simple car drive,
Sure.
it takes a day and a half, but you can do it.
Yeah.
So is there anything to be done in New York State right now, or really does it have to be done on a national level?
I mean, we try to keep folks who have firearms in a way that we know where the guns are going, and that there is a very rigorous and strict process in order to get a gun license in the state of New York or in the city of New York. But we can only take that so far. The federal government really has to do its job at this point in making sure that we reform our gun laws. That doesn't infringe on anybody's Second Amendment rights, because I think that's a nonsense argument. What we really need to do.
Okay, we need to wrap it up, so
Yep.
you got to be quick.
So very
Answer
quickly.
the question.
So quickly, keep the guns out of folks who shouldn't have firearms, and that gun owners should be more responsible with their firearms.
Assemblyman Victor Pichardo, thank you so much. We
My pleasure.
appreciate your time. I'm sorry the opponent wasn't here, but we've had a nice half hour. If you do get reelected, we will certainly invite you back to have more dialogue on BronxTalk.
I
Thank
will
you.
most certainly be back, Eric.
Okay, great. Folks, we know that the candidate will agree with me that everyone should come out to vote on September 13th. Please note, it is a primary election, so only registered voters enrolled in the Democratic primary in the 86th can vote in this race. Also, October 14th is the last date to register to vote in the November 8th national election. It's also the last date to enroll in a party for all the 2017 primaries, which will include primaries for the mayor, the controller, public advocate, borough president, city council, et cetera, et cetera. But that's for 2017. Make sure you register. Also, we do want to thank our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters. For more information, you can call the League at 212-725-3541. That's 212-725-3541. We want to thank the hardest working producer in show business is Jayla Juberis, our director, Michael Leone. Helen does a great job, the cast, the thousands around here. Vote on September 13th. We'll see you next week. Good night.